congregation, I am astonished to tell you that we now have people from some 121 countries who watch us. Some 63% of you are men, 37% of you are women, and most of you are aged between 46 and 64 years of age. So we at St Michael's in Melbourne welcome you. I'm presently trying to develop a new project that will focus on people between the ages of 46 and 64 years of age, and people between the age of 65 and 95 years of age. It is to be the extension of my earlier work, which I called The 30 Vital Years, published as a book some years ago. In these early days of the project, I've been asking people over the age of 80 and 90, what now is important, most important, that you need? What is your most troublesome frustration at this point in your life? All of us with just a little residue of hope in us surely would like to live their late 80s and 90s. And we'd like to live with happiness, with health, with good humor, and with some measure of hilarity. So hope, happiness, health, humor, hilarity. 6. When we're in our 20s, our readings on all 6 of those would probably read 9.1 on a scale of 0 to 10. But in our 80s and 90s, our readings on all those might well drop back to something like 3.5, 2.1. Well, the other day I asked a man, 92 years of age, what he most wanted. He's a man of strong health, considerable wealth, and well-acknowledged achievements. He said the thing most missing was real life satisfaction. And in the silence that followed, I think we both knew what he was saying. The external concerns of his life were all good. As he would say, all the boxes are ticked. Indeed, later on he said, I've been very lucky. But the inner self was somewhat not satisfied, a gap. Somewhere within his otherwise abundant life, there was a sense of starvation. It is probably something we're all reluctant to acknowledge if we experience it. We evade it by calling up our blessings. Oh yes, I shouldn't complain because look. We fear the starvation of our mind, the starvation of our spirit, the starvation of our inner life. Today I read out that story of Joseph and his brothers. The brothers were starving, or their people were starving. So they traveled to Egypt to purchase grain that they so urgently needed. They went never dreaming for a moment that they were going to meet their brother Joseph, the brother that they'd sold into slavery, the brother that they'd left for dead, the brother for whom they had once held such jealousy, hatred, and envy. But he recognized them. They didn't recognize him. He had now become, as I said earlier, he'd become the Prime Minister of Egypt, parceling out the grain that he'd stored in those 7 good years. So here we have them and Joseph. Them coming in need, Joseph standing at the doorway to the barns of Egypt. They were not strong enough, the brothers, to carry out a raid or a war, as we might do these days. Rather, they came in hope, not knowing that Joseph could have sent them away. But the story unfolded in a different way, and thus became something to be told for thousands of years through the generations. Many of you were here for the Ken Miller graduation when Dr. Ranjana Srivastava, the oncologist, often with a piece, her page in the papers each week, she gave the graduation address. This week she sent me a copy of her new book. It is a book about them and us. The hospital, the doctors, the nurses, them, and us, the patients, the visitors. How often, as her book unfolds, you read how often the staff, them, are so busy, so focused on the important point of their immediate concern that they don't pause to listen to us, the patient. Or they don't engage us, the patient, in ways that we might be part of the treatment, part of the healing process. And she gave example after example of people dying for a chat, but there was no time. And so she called her book Dying for a Chat. I've also mentioned in the past Dr. Atal Gawande's book called Better. He's a surgeon. He wrote a book in similar vein, describing how important it was for us to talk. He said one surgeon in his late 30s saw 36 patients in 3 hours. But he would speak to each one of them in a slow, quiet way that made each one of them listen to hear what he had to say. Of course, he could be brusque sometimes, but he did what he could give to everyone. He gave to them his individual attention. The last words of Dr. Gawande's book, he said, ask people what they think. Keep the conversation going between them and us. Well, of course, most of us are in a different territory every day. We're in the morning traffic, the bad behaviour in the trams and on the trains, or in the traffic generally. People complaining as if they had nothing important to do. They complain about this little thing or that. This is all their life, them and us. And they focus on the flaws of them, often not seeing their own blind spots. The fact that half the urban population of cities in the Western world lives alone leads many of them to fill their minds with images of them and us. And it rapidly takes their psychology into suspicion and distrust and danger and anxiety and anger, hostility, hate, abuse, and violence. Many would say, well, that's what it is to be human, isn't it? We're made that way. And so they behave that way, them and us. And so we all become, as in a sense, them and us become united in being human beings, behaving less than the possible. I'd like to be able to say that the churches and religion could change all that, could show a better example. But the churches are often all too ready dealers in suspicion and distrust and danger and anxiety and anger and hostility and hate and abuse and violence. You've got the words, there they are, and you can see them outside the church and inside. Indeed, they, church and religion, can be so blinded to their blind spots that they go on promulgating so much piety, so much dogma. They get lost in theological arguments about the most obscure issues and ideas, that they're no longer listening to us, the people. Basic to faith and theology these days, surely at all times, but particularly these days with our advancing knowledge, basic to faith and theology ought to be a strong understanding of human psychology. That should infiltrate every theological school, every theological discussion. The human personality, the human thought processes, the human behavior. Failing to be thus involved is really an appalling neglect of our duty of care. You read one bishop this last week in the sexual abuse inquiry. He was reported as saying that the church's behavior was unchristlike. Unchristlike. When, if we read it aright, and if the courts have adjudicated such, we see that the behavior was, in fact, protecting, over many, many years, people involved in criminal behavior. Is that unchristlike? We need to go further, you see, and say, no, it's more than that. So we go back to Joseph, you see, Joseph and his brothers. The church has sold so many people out, left them for dead, and indeed they did die. It's not all bad, however, and we need to stress the other side so we get a better perspective. The churches do things that are especially good, right down at the grassroots, if not up where I and my crowd sit, then down at the grassroots. Some really good things happen. Craig Barnes is the current president of Princeton Theological Seminary. Before he took up that position just recently, he was a minister in one of the churches. He wrote of his early congregation of 20 years earlier. And he remembered in that congregation one particular family. There were two boys, just 4 or 5 years of age. One boy's name was Scott. And the father would bring these two boys to Sunday school. He made sure that these two kids went on the church camps. They went on church expeditions. But the mother was never there because she was a chronic alcoholic. They had tried everything to help her. Treatment, the lot. But eventually she virtually burnt the house down. And so the husband left her and took the two boys away. The minister, Craig Barnes, he too left the congregation, aware that so many things had not been done. 20 years later, as president of the seminary, he was absolutely astonished to hear that the 5-year-old boy, Scott, was now 25 years of age, studying for the ministry in this seminary. So he picked up the phone and called the young man to come to his office. And Scott, the 25-year-old lad, told him that his parents had divorced, that his father had lost his job and, in fact, lost their new home, and his mother was now permanently in a nursing home. So when he asked Scott, the president of the seminary asked Scott, why had he chosen the ministry for his career? And he said, the boy replied, it's simple. During all his growing up years, members of the congregation were constantly on their doorstep with meals, helping the boys get ready for this and for that, taking them here, taking them there, all done without a word of criticism or judgment. He said he'd never got over the love of that congregation as they kept showing up on his doorstep year in and year out, when there was only heartache on the other side of the door. So why has he joined the ministry? He said, now it's my turn to give something back. Good things can happen too in the them and us. So Joseph's brothers were there, suspicious, distrusting, anxious and fearful, and above all on a mission to relieve the starvation of their people. And Joseph said, "Come closer, come closer." And they came closer and he said, "I am your brother. I am your brother. Do not be fearful, but go and give this message to our father. I am alive." Too often in all the tangle of mind and emotion, we lose that critical sense of who we are. We hang on to our past. We show all too clearly the flaws in our personality. And we cease to realize and demonstrate that we are alive. Above all else, we are alive and that there is a future to anticipate and to live. That's part of the story of Joseph. Come closer. Do not revisit the past with further fears and recriminations. The years of starvation are over. Let us celebrate that we are alive and we have a future to be lived and explored, them and us. But what of me? Yes, don't forget, there's always the single one, the me. The 92-year-old said to me, he now wanted most of all some personal life satisfaction, which had somehow evaded him. Like Joseph, he was surrounded by achievements and influence, but inside there was a lack, a loss, an honest starvation. The imagery recurs again and again throughout your Bible. And we read the parable today of putting the grain into the right, discerning what was the real grain and putting it into the barns. Making the critical decision of what to store and what to throw away. And we inserted in front of the reading today a very important explanation that this was not just a matter of a story of wheat and weeds and barns in the farmyard. It was a good symbol of the healthy self. All the externals can be in place, but you need to store the right goodness in your inner self, the right health, the right strengths, and the right self-celebration within your inner self. Otherwise, we begin to starve. There is therefore a huge step to take to understand what will that be for each one of us. Them and us, but what about me? To step over the past, to re-own the parent that we lost, and finding those things that will bring us alive. So when my 92-year-old friend said he wanted to find satisfaction, where will I point him? Or better still, where would you point him? Or would you remain silent, as indeed those of us who were with him did? There is the very strength of life itself. It's given. So the Bible today in the epistle said, look for the good, the true, and the beautiful. Those things that bring out the best, those things that are really excellent, those things that evoke your strongest admiration. So I'm going to take another step around this whole business that we're looking at today, the them and the us, and what about me? In recent years, many books and journals have marketed the idea of spirituality And they've used all sorts of language and ideas and themes and imagery. And I must confess I don't have much empathy for it. There is that religious spirituality and the secular spirituality. And they leave me unsatisfied. The story today, I think, has some good themes about spirituality without even mentioning the word. And I'm going to put them to you. In seriatim, one after the other, six issues. Spirituality, that inner self nurture, that inner self that sometimes is unsatisfied. It is, number one, it is to nurture an expansive aliveness of who you really are. Number two, it is the capacity to leave the negative past behind. Number three, it is to reach out to new expressions of resilience and harmony somewhere. Number four, it is to see a demonstrable expression of empathy and compassion. Number five, it is to celebrate life's gifts. And number six, it is to step over our anxious state and step into a different way of being. Would you please stand? I invite you to gather around the holy table, here to receive some special gifts of life, here to let that inner gap be examined, explored, and filled. The promise is given, the gift is given. Would you sing the communion hymn? It speaks of the presence. As we gather around the altar, we are aware of the presence.